America, meet Tony Rudy. If you already know him, meet him again. When you think Tony Rudy, think Jack Abramoff, Republican uber lobbyist, massive multi-tentacled corruption and bribery scandal. Tony Rudy was one of Jack Abramoff's guys. He was a Washington lobbyist who was one of the very first people to plead guilty in the whole Jack Abramoff saga. Much of what we, in fact, know about the Jack Abramoff criminal enterprise was because of Tony Rudy melodiously singing to federal prosecutors once he turned himself in. And even though Jack Abramoff himself has now been to trial, been to jail, and has been, in fact, released from jail, Tony Rudy has essentially been stuck in judicial limbo for about 6 years. Until now, Tony Rudy has just become the very last person to be sentenced in the whole Jack Abramoff corruption saga. Mr. Rudy's punishment, as handed down by a U.S. District Court judge in D.C., 5 months in a halfway house and 3 years probation. 5 months in a halfway house, but frankly, a lifetime in the history of Washington scandal. This, for example, is the famous photo of Jack Abramoff. He's the guy left in the black baggy polo shirt. You can also see Mr. Abramoff's pal, Ralph Reed, professional, pious, moral scold, the former head of the Christian Coalition. That's also Republican Congressman Bob Ney of Ohio over on the right in the white polo shirt. He later turned that polo shirt in for prison stripes instead. These guys are seen here mugging for the camera during an all-expenses-paid trip to the historic St. Andrews Golf Resort in Scotland in 2002. This junket was a Tony Rudy joint. Mr. Rudy helped organize the all-expenses-paid part of this golf trip. When Congressman Bob Ney got home from that golf trip, he said that the whole thing had been paid for by a group called the National Center for Public Policy. That group denied paying for the Scotland trip at the time, but they were hip deep in the Abramoff scandal. Before Tony Rudy worked for Jack Abramoff, he worked in the congressional office of House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. He served as an aide to Tom DeLay in the mid-1990s. While he was there, Tom DeLay took a 6-day trip to Russia. Again, Jack Abramoff went along for the ride. Again, all expenses were paid. And again, like Bob Ney, Tom DeLay claimed the whole thing was paid for and organized by this obscure, forgettable Washington, D.C. nonprofit called the National Center for Public Policy Research. This organization, it turns out, funded all sorts of Jack Abramoff-related activities. Remember, Abramoff's goal was to serve his corporate clients by essentially using corporate money to bribe members of Congress to support legislation that favored whatever corporation had hired him. And this group, the National Center for Public Policy Research, was essentially one of the ways that Abramoff funneled money or perks to various members of Congress. So Jack Abramoff would have his client, the Choctaw Indians, for example, donate tens of thousands of dollars to this obscure, forgettable group, this National Center for Public Policy Research, and then that group would bankroll an all-expenses-paid trip to Scotland for Tom DeLay. That 6-day trip to Russia that Tom DeLay said was paid for by the National Center for Public Policy Research, it actually appears to have been paid for with money that was given to that group by Abramoff's Russian oil clients. So the money comes from an Abramoff client. It gets paid out to members of Congress in the form of golf trips or whatever. But because there's this little forgettable organization in the middle moving the money, nobody's supposed to be the wiser about where the corporate money is ending up. This innocuously named National Center for Public Policy Research was essentially the middleman between the corporate money and whatever legislative goal they were paying Jack Abramoff to arrange for them in Congress. The National Center for Public Policy Research. Put a pin in that name for just a second. Today, one of the most significant developments in the How This Country Makes Our Laws department was that the ginormous consumer products corporation Procter & Gamble became the 13th major company to drop out of an organization called ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a corporate-funded group that promotes conservative legislation at the state level. Basically, corporations join ALEC. ALEC then writes model legislation to serve the bottom line of those corporations. ALEC then spoon-feeds that legislation to mostly Republican state legislators across the country, and those legislators turn it into law. Corporations essentially get to pay for the result. They get to shield their influence through this third-party group in order to achieve some policy goal. It's a perfect setup. It was a perfect setup, at least, until ALEC started getting all sorts of unwanted attention for pushing stuff like the stand your ground gun laws, laws that make it harder for people to vote as well. I mean, sure, those things might be good for some corporation's bottom line somewhere, but how about the effect on the rest of us? ALEC last week announced that they are disbanding their task force that pushed for things like the relaxed gun laws and laws to make it harder to vote. ALEC is now officially getting out of that particular part of their game when it comes to making it harder for people to vote across this country. Guess who's taking their place? A group called the National Center for Public Policy Research. That Jack Abramoff-linked middleman organization that helped funnel cash and perks from Jack Abramoff's corporate clients to members of Congress, they have now announced that they're taking over the voter ID stuff. They are launching a new voter identification task force in order to pick up where ALEC left off, to keep pushing bills that make it harder for people to vote across this country. Corporate money has always wormed its way into politics. Guys like Jack Abramoff and Tom DeLay and Ralph Reed and Tony Rudy made a transfixing illegal art form out of doing that. But could a scandal like that even happen today? Would an oil company or whoever even bother with Abramoff and with the middleman? Will secretive ALEC and these other corporate front groups even bother recovering now that they have shrunk in the light of day? Why would they bother? Why would they bother now that corporate money is not only almost all there is in politics, it's not only no longer illegal, it is now not even considered to be embarrassing anymore? Could these scandals even happen anymore if these scandals happen because of people trying to cover up what they did, and now nobody is ashamed of it any longer? Frank Rich joins us to talk about that next.